Hey guys, tonight we step into chambers where velvet curtains are drawn so thick they swallow even the faintest flicker of candlelight. You find yourself inside a world hushed by ceremony and trembling with expectation, the kind of room where air seems to grow heavy, perfumed with beeswax and rosewater, and where the walls carry secrets you probably wouldn't survive repeating at court. This isn't just any bed we're looking at, it's the stage for one of history's strangest rituals, the royal wedding night. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The room you've wandered into is not as private as you might imagine. Velvet drapes hang around a massive carved bed, each post rising like a miniature tower. Above, a canopy embroidered with the family crest looms, a reminder that this union isn't about love, it's about politics. You trace the edge of a quilt heavy with gold thread and notice how stiff it feels, more ceremonial than comfortable. Somewhere beneath this display of wealth lies a nervous bride and an equally nervous groom. They're not here to share romance. They're here to satisfy a dynasty. The first thing that strikes you is how orchestrated it all feels. From the clinking of goblets to the soft shuffling of slippers outside the door, the wedding night of royalty was less about intimacy and more about performance. You might imagine hushed giggles in the candlelight, but instead there's a court official clearing his throat loudly in the hallway, just in case the couple forgets they're being watched. Figuratively and sometimes literally, you catch yourself smirking at how different this is from modern honeymoons. While today people dream of beaches in Bali or Parisian hotels, medieval kings and queens often spent their first hours together under the scrutiny of priests, physicians, and half the noble court. If you're thinking that sounds awkward, well, historians still argue whether awkward is even the right word, or whether it was simply terrifying. One mainstream fact is clear. Consummation was not just expected, it was a requirement. The marriage wasn't considered valid until the act was done, and in some places until it was done publicly enough to be undeniable. Without heirs, dynasties crumbled, and so much pressure was piled onto that first night that it makes modern wedding jitters look like nothing. As you let your eyes wander across the chamber, you spot little details that reveal more than they should. A small reliquary by the bedside holds a saint's bone, thought to bring fertility blessings. Near the foot of the bed, a folded sheet of parchment, likely a prayer written in Latin, rests within reach just in case divine help is needed. The air smells faintly of lavender, sprinkled on the pillows not for relaxation, but for supposed aphrodisiac qualities. It's as though the room itself is conspiring to make the couple perform their duty. But then a quirky little tidbit comes to mind. In some courts, a crowd of rowdy friends might actually carry the bride and groom to bed, laughing and singing bawdy songs as they deposited the new couple under the covers. Imagine being shoved into bed like a reluctant child at a sleepover, except your friends are dukes and duchesses, making jokes about your stamina. Sleep suddenly feels very far away. You lean closer, as if you might overhear whispers through the heavy curtains. There's a soft rustling, the bride shifting nervously, the groom trying to find his courage. Outside, someone coughs again, reminding everyone of the duty still hanging in the air. And you realize that for all the pomp, all the gilded embroidery, this moment was profoundly human. Two people fumbling in the dark, pressured to create a future for an entire kingdom. Royal wedding nights were never truly private, never truly simple, and certainly never free from scandal. Already in this velvet-hung chamber, you can sense how a single night could shape decades of politics or topple a dynasty if things went wrong, and you haven't even reached the truly bizarre traditions yet. Ever wondered what it feels like to have your most intimate moment turned into a semi-public event? You probably wouldn't envy the newlyweds of a medieval or early modern royal court because, believe it or not, in many kingdoms across Europe, the wedding night wasn't just about the couple. It was about the entire realm, watching, waiting, and in some cases literally peeking through the curtains. Picture it. After hours of feasting and dancing, the bride and groom are ushered into the bedchamber by a procession of family members, priests, and courtiers. Instead of being left alone, they might find themselves surrounded by an audience. In France, for example, it was customary for members of the royal household to crowd into the room and watch the couple climb into bed. They didn't stay for everything, but the message was clear. Privacy was a luxury these two would not enjoy tonight. The reasoning was straightforward, at least from a dynastic perspective. Marriage in royal circles was less about love than about producing heirs. A marriage without consummation was like a treaty without signatures, void and subject to annulment. So the whole court had a vested interest in making sure the act began on schedule. If that meant gathering around the bed, so be it. Imagine trying to get in the mood while your uncle, the archbishop, adjusts his spectacles in the corner. Historians still argue whether these public consummations were literal, like full exposure in front of witnesses, or symbolic, with everyone waiting until the couple was under the covers, then discreetly exiting. Either way, the ritual wasn't just theatre. It was a contract being enforced with every awkward cough and sideways glance. Here's one mainstream fact. In Tudor England, when Mary Tudor married Philip of Spain, the couple was ceremoniously escorted to their bed by attendants who pulled back the sheets and made sure they were properly tucked in. The door wasn't closed until the royal pair had at least made the symbolic gesture of lying down together. No pressure, right? But here's the quirky tidbit that makes you raise an eyebrow. In some parts of France and Scotland, nobles would sit outside the chamber door, mugs of ale in hand, singing bawdy songs while they listened for evidence, consummation. Yes, imagine a medieval version of a frat party outside your honeymoon suite. The louder the noises from within, the more convinced everyone became that the marriage was off to a proper start. Talk about invasive. And then there was the proof. In many courts, the sheets would be inspected the next morning for signs of success. The stained linens were often displayed like trophies, held aloft by servants before a cheering crowd. If they were unstained, well, then the rumours began, and in royal courts, rumours were more dangerous than armies. As you let that image drift in your mind, you might smirk at the absurdity, but also sense the very real anxiety involved. A couple's ability to perform under these bizarre circumstances could make or break alliances, alter succession plans, and even spark wars. You recall how, later in history, Marie Antoinette's delayed consummation with Louis XVI became a political crisis whispered about across Europe. But already, centuries before, the stage was being set for that kind of scandal. You might joke to yourself that at least there wasn't social media back then. Imagine waking up to hashtags like "Royal, how wedding fail," trending across kingdoms. Still, gossip travelled fast enough. Servants whispered in taverns, nobles whispered in council chambers, and before long the whole continent knew whether a royal bed was fruitful or barren. The irony, of course, is that behind all the pomp and the ritual, it came down to two ordinary human beings, often teenagers, often strangers, fumbling in the dark with everyone else's expectations pressing down on their shoulders. The sheets may have been silk, but the weight on them was heavier than stone. And as you drift further into this story, you realize the velvet curtains weren't drawn to create privacy. They were drawn to frame the performance. You might not expect this, but when you strip away the lace and the ceremonial chanting, royal marriages were essentially business deals, often the most expensive, nerve-wracking mergers in history. That soft, candle-lit bed you imagine wasn't just a bed, it was a treaty document written in flesh and blood. When two royals lay down together, entire kingdoms shifted beneath them. Think of it this way. A medieval wedding wasn't about romance. The bride and groom may not have even met before their vows. Instead, the wedding night sealed alliances that armies couldn't. France married Spain not because they had great chemistry, but because their thrones needed stability. England betrothed princesses to Habsburg princes, hoping to secure peace, or at least delay war. And behind every sigh, every nervous glance, you could almost hear the rattling of coins and the shuffling of border treaties. One mainstream fact that makes this clear: is the 1469 marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Their union did more than unite two nervous newlyweds under a canopy bed. It created the foundation for the modern Spanish kingdom. Yet even their first night wasn't entirely private. Chroniclers note how the consummation of their marriage was treated as a political turning point, something the court eagerly awaited proof of, as though the couple were living headlines. And here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost comedic. In medieval France, sometimes nobles literally bet on whether the marriage would be consummated. Wagers were laid, whispers traded, and coins exchanged in smoky chambers as courtiers speculated whether the groom would rise to the occasion. You think your relatives asking when you'll have kids is bad? Try having an entire aristocracy gambling on your love life. But the stakes were deadly serious. If consummation didn't happen, the marriage could be annulled, treaties ripped apart, wars reignited. Henry VIII famously used non-consummation as a legal escape hatch. When his marriage to Anne of Cleves failed to produce a spark on their wedding night, he declared the marriage unconsummated and neatly set it aside, much like you'd return an unwanted purchase to the store. Historians still argue whether Henry was truly incapable that night, or whether he just didn't fancy Anne's looks and used the lack of passion as his political parachute. You might imagine the pressure in the bedchamber, two awkward people knowing that if things didn't go according to plan, entire nations could spiral into conflict. Forget performance anxiety, this was geopolitical anxiety. Somewhere an advisor was already drafting contingency treaties in case the night ended badly. The sheer transactional nature of these nights makes you pause. Love poems and flowery oaths at the altar were for show. What really mattered was the next morning. Was the marriage real? Were the sheets displayed? Did ambassadors return home with good news? And perhaps most chillingly, was there a future heir, now potentially in the making? Picture yourself lying there, the flickering candle throwing shadows on gilded wallpaper, and instead of focusing on your partner, you're imagining emissaries sharpening their quills to report on your performance. It makes a modern honeymoon argument about hotel bookings look laughably trivial. Yet even in the midst of such cold calculation, there were moments of humanity. A shy laugh, a whispered comfort, a bride clutching a charm from her childhood, hidden beneath silks. The history books rarely mention those moments, but you sense them lingering between the lines, ghosts of real people buried under layers of duty. So as you drift deeper into this world, remember, for royals, the wedding bed was never just about passion, it was about politics, written into the fabric of the sheets. And sometimes those sheets told stories that toppled thrones. You probably think of clean sheets as something fresh and cozy, but for royals, a set of wedding linens could become evidence in the most bizarre courtroom trial of all. Forget love letters or whispered rumours. The sheets themselves were the star witnesses, sometimes paraded in front of entire courts to prove whether a marriage had truly begun. The obsession started with one very practical worry: legitimacy. Dynasties survived only if heirs were unquestionably legitimate. If a queen bore a child without clear proof that her marriage had been consummated, rivals could whisper doubts, and those whispers could ignite civil wars. So the solution was as simple as it was awkward: inspect the sheets for stains. In France, the tradition became almost theatrical. After the couple's first night, servants would gather the bedding and march it triumphantly to the waiting crowd. Courtiers craned their necks, ambassadors scribbled notes, and somewhere in the back, a skeptical cousin muttered, "Are we really doing this?" The linens were sometimes even displayed from palace windows, fluttering like victory flags. One mainstream fact comes from the 16th century Valois court. There are records of entire councils convened the morning after a royal wedding just to confirm that the marriage was consummated, based largely on the condition of those linens. Imagine sitting in a council chamber, listening as high-ranking nobles discuss the colour, texture and placement of stains with the seriousness of diplomats negotiating peace. But here's a quirky tidbit. In Scotland, there was a tradition of not just inspecting the sheets, but also rewarding the chambermaids who handled them. If the linens showed signs of consummation, servants might be tipped with coins or gifts, as though they'd personally contributed to the success. Historians still argue whether this was genuine gratitude or just another layer of performative ritual, but either way, the poor servants couldn't exactly say no, and the practice wasn't always about joy. Sometimes it backfired spectacularly. If the sheets came up clean, the couple's private struggle became painfully public. Whispers turned to accusations. Was the groom impotent? Was the bride not a virgin? Did one of them secretly resist? The King of Portugal, John V, once endured weeks of ridicule because of an unsuccessful wedding night, with mocking ballads spreading across Lisbon faster than wildfire. You lean into this scene, imagining the tension. A pair of nervous newlyweds, exhausted from the day's ceremonies, finally collapse into bed. Hours later, before the sun even rises, the bedclothes are whisked away like crime scene evidence, carried through the halls where nobles wait eagerly for confirmation. A single piece of fabric suddenly holds the fate of nations. And then there's the irony. Everyone was desperate for proof, but proof itself was never truly reliable. Sheets could be staged, maids could be bribed, couples could fake what was expected. Historians still argue whether some of the most famous, successful consummations were genuine or political theatre designed to keep the peace. After all, when a king's dignity and a queen's reputation were at stake, what's a little deception between dynasties? As you picture the linens held aloft, flapping like banners in a drafty hallway, you can't help but chuckle at the absurdity. In an age of knights and castles, wars and coronations, entire kingdoms sometimes hinged on whether a bed looked messy enough the next morning. It makes you wonder if, when the bride and groom finally drifted to sleep beneath those heavy covers, they dreamed not of romance, but of sheets being carried through torchlit halls, their private night turned into public proof. And if you listen closely, you might almost hear the laughter of servants who knew the whole affair was equal parts ceremony and farce. Ever found yourself nervous before a first date? Now multiply that by 1,000, add the weight of a crown, and imagine an entire continent waiting to hear about your performance. That was the reality for many kings and princes on their wedding nights, the strange, suffocating pressure to prove their virility in a single evening. Royal masculinity wasn't measured by charm, kindness, or even military victories. It was measured by whether a king could successfully consummate his marriage. A failure in bed was seen as a failure of rule, and the court rarely let such whispers stay private. One mainstream fact is that Louis XVI of France endured nearly 7 years of ridicule for not consummating his marriage to Marie Antoinette right away. The young couple struggled, and soon pamphlets, jokes, and mocking songs circulated through Paris, blaming both the Queen and her inept husband. The scandal wasn't just bedroom gossip, it undermined the monarchy itself. Imagine being 19 years old, standing in a chamber lit by flickering tapers, your wife a nervous teenager you barely know, and the next morning your entire reputation hinges on what did, or didn't, happen. You probably wouldn't sleep well either. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some royal courts even scheduled consummation as though it were part of the wedding itinerary. In England, observers recorded the time a groom entered the chamber and the time he exited, noting the duration with the seriousness of accountants. In France, courtiers joked about whether a king's short visit to the bedchamber foretold anything about his reign. The line between intimacy and theatre blurred so thoroughly that it's hard to tell whether people were cheering for love or politics, or just for gossip. Historians still argue whether this pressure helped or harmed dynasties. On one hand, proof of consummation reassured everyone that heirs might be on the way. On the other, it created crippling anxiety. Some young royals delayed intimacy for months, hoping to avoid humiliation. Others sought out physicians, priests, or even magical remedies to improve their odds. The very act that should have been natural became mechanical, weighed down by expectation. Take Henry VIII, for instance. His marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled, partly because he claimed he couldn't consummate it. But he was quick to remind everyone that with other wives he had no trouble. Whether this was truth or spin remains a debate. What's certain is that the king's performance became a matter of public record, discussed not just in court, but across Europe. You can almost hear him sighing, "It's not me, it's her," centuries before the phrase became cliché. The image of a royal couple under such scrutiny is almost tragic. The groom, sweating beneath his nightshirt, knows that by dawn his kingdom's stability rests on his ability to do what nature demands. The bride, equally nervous, carries the double burden of proving her virginity and her fertility. And all the while, outside the chamber, ambassadors, servants, and nobles whisper, placing bets, trading smirks, and preparing their morning reports. It almost feels like a cruel joke that the fate of kingdoms could rest on something so private, so human, and yet so relentlessly public. You might chuckle at the thought, but you also feel the weight of the silence in that chamber, the way the candlelight flickers against stone walls as history itself seems to hold its breath, waiting to see whether a king is truly a king. You probably wouldn't think about it today, but one of the great fears surrounding royal weddings wasn't whether the couple would like each other. It was whether they were even who they claimed to be. Behind all the velvet curtains and ceremonial beds lurked a very real paranoia, the fear of impostors. Dynasties were fragile things, and swapping a bride or groom at the last moment could rewrite alliances, redirect inheritances, or ignite wars. So wedding nights often included strange and sometimes invasive checks to ensure that the bride and groom were the actual individuals promised in the treaty. You imagine the discomfort of being under those heavy embroidered covers and realizing the chambermaid or a physician had been instructed to verify your identity. One mainstream fact comes from the 15th century, when Margaret of Denmark married James III of Scotland. Chroniclers noted how members of the court insisted on escorting her all the way into the chamber, carefully noting her every detail, as though someone might have swapped her for a lookalike on the walk down the hall. These weren't just superstitions. Royal impostors were a genuine political threat. Entire wars, like the Wars of the Roses, were riddled with claimants who may or may not have been who they said they were. And here's a quirky tidbit that sounds almost like a fairy tale gone wrong. In parts of medieval Germany, there are records of brides being literally undressed by attendants in front of witnesses, the idea being that a switch couldn't possibly happen if everyone saw the bride's birthmarks or scars. It's hard to imagine a less romantic beginning unless your idea of intimacy involves a committee. Historians still argue whether these identity checks were more symbolic or truly rigorous. Some argue that the practice of inspecting brides was mostly theatrical, meant to remind everyone that impostors were a real fear. Others point to detailed records of midwives and physicians being summoned, which suggests the inspections could be uncomfortably thorough. Either way, the result was the same. The couple's privacy was eroded before they'd even begun. You picture it now. A nervous groom sits on the bed, tugging at the collar of his nightshirt, while outside the curtains, nobles murmur about whether his bride has the right family features, the right accent, the right jewelry. And perhaps somewhere in the back of his mind, he wonders if she's wondering the same about him. After all, disguises went both ways. One of the most infamous cases of impostor suspicion came centuries later, when rumors spread that a French dauphin's bride had been replaced on the journey by a more politically favorable princess. While there's no solid evidence this ever happened, the fact that people believed it tells you how potent the fear was. In courts where secrets brewed like spiced wine, even the smallest doubt could destabilize an entire throne. The irony, of course, is that amid all the scrutiny, all the elaborate checks, couples were still expected to somehow relax enough to fulfill their duty. Imagine trying to build intimacy when your first shared experience as husband and wife involved strangers scrutinizing your freckles. No amount of lavender on the pillows could undo that kind of tension. As you let the image fade, you realize that the royal bedchamber wasn't a sanctuary at all. It was more like a stage, a courtroom, and sometimes even a customs checkpoint, all rolled into one. And behind those velvet curtains, kings and queens had to prove not just their passion, but their very identities. You might not expect this, but some royal wedding nights began less like honeymoons and more like laboratory experiments. Once the curtains were drawn, it wasn't uncommon for the groom's very potency to be questioned, tested, and sometimes even documented. The test of potency became one of the strangest and most humiliating traditions to shadow a royal bed. Imagine the scene. A nervous prince sits on the edge of a grand bed, its sheets crisp and embroidered with gold thread. Instead of being left to his new bride, he's visited by physicians, priests, or nosy courtiers, eager to ensure that he's capable of performing the expected duties. Failure wasn't simply personal, it was political dynamite. Without heirs, entire dynasties teetered on collapse. One mainstream fact comes from France in the 16th century. When King Henry IV annulled his marriage to Margaret of Valois, the question of his potency was dragged into court. Witnesses were called to testify about whether he was physically capable, and the matter was treated with the seriousness of a military crisis. It wasn't just gossip, it was state business. And then comes the quirky tidbit that's almost unbelievable. In certain Italian courts, grooms were sometimes given trial runs. Yes, you heard that right. There are records of young noblemen being sent to midwives or even prostitutes before marriage to confirm their readiness. It was considered less scandalous to have a pre-wedding test than to fail on the wedding night with half of Europe waiting for news. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or rare exceptions whispered about in corners, but the fact that it happened at all is almost comical. Imagine trying to drift to sleep with this pressure. You're not just trying to impress your bride, you're trying to prove your worth as a king, a husband, and the continuation of your entire bloodline. Outside the chamber, advisors pace like anxious stage managers, whispering about remedies, spiced wine, oysters, exotic herbs. If all else fails, some courts believed prayers to certain saints could restore vigor. You picture a priest quietly muttering invocations while the couple wrestled with their nerves inside. Historians still debate just how effective these rituals were, or whether they simply added to the crushing anxiety. After all, what could be less relaxing than the knowledge that your ability to perform would be reported to ambassadors the very next day? The sad irony is that brides often bore the brunt of these failures. If the sheets came back unstained, tongues wagged not just about the groom's ability, but about the bride's virginity. Was she resisting? Was she too cold? Or worse, was she already spoiled? One woman's reputation could be destroyed overnight, even if the real problem lay entirely with her husband. As you lie there in your imagination, the candlelight flickers against stone walls, casting long shadows. The heavy quilt feels like a lead weight pressing down, the silence punctuated by whispers outside the door. Somewhere in the room, a talisman hangs from the bedpost, a charm against infertility. You can almost hear the anxious heartbeat of history itself, pounding beneath the silence, demanding proof that the bloodline will continue. And all the while, the test of potency looms like a ghost in the room. Not a romantic first night, but a trial, a performance, and a judgment rolled into one. You might laugh at the thought, but some royal couples weren't even left alone to figure things out. Advisors, priests, and even physicians sometimes hovered just out of sight, quite literally standing in the shadows of the bedchamber, ready to whisper instructions if the young bride and groom fumbled on their wedding night. Picture the scene. A heavy oak door closes, the crowd disperses, and finally, the newlyweds are alone. Except not really. Behind the embroidered curtains, a nervous king fidgets with the ties of his nightshirt. His bride stares down at her gilded slippers, and in the corner, a priest clears his throat softly as if to say, "Don't mind me, I'm just here for spiritual guidance." Privacy? A foreign concept. One mainstream fact that illustrates this is the marriage of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The couple's long delay in consummation worried both the French and Austrian courts so much that physicians and advisors actually offered bedroom advice, coaching them on intimacy as if preparing them for a royal tournament. The King of France and his young queen were reduced to awkward students, their bedroom a classroom where ambassadors awaited exam results. And here's a quirky tidbit. In medieval England, some grooms were given literal how-to manuals written by clerics, full of advice on positions, prayers, and even dietary suggestions for the wedding night. One such manual suggested avoiding heavy meats before consummation, lest indigestion ruin the moment. You can almost picture a young prince nibbling nervously on boiled pears, while a chaplain reminded him that timing was everything. Historians still argue whether advisors actually remained in the room during consummation, or whether their presence was more symbolic, standing nearby, ready to intervene if rumors of failure spread. Either way, the intrusion was undeniable. The royal bedchamber wasn't a sanctuary, it was a workplace, with supervisors hovering like managers checking in on a rookie employee. Imagine lying in bed while your physician, quill in hand, notes your progress like a science experiment. Yes, Your Grace. Steady breathing. Perhaps relax the shoulders. Excellent form. It's absurd, almost comical, and yet it carried deadly serious consequences. If the couple didn't succeed, treaties crumbled, alliances fractured, and whispers of annulment spread like wildfire. The pressure was suffocating. A young queen might clutch a charm under her pillow, her grandmother's relic meant to ensure fertility. A groom might sip spiced wine laced with herbs, recommended by court doctors to boost courage. And all the while, shadows loomed, figures half seen, half heard, waiting to confirm that nature had done its work. You can almost feel the claustrophobia of that bedchamber, the thick curtains trapping heat, the bed creaking under the weight of expectation, the silence broken by a cough from an advisor outside the door. Romance barely stood a chance, and yet somehow royal couples managed to navigate these absurd circumstances, fumbling their way toward dynasties that shaped history. It leaves you wondering whether the whispers of advisors were comforting, humiliating, or both. Perhaps the only thing more awkward than having to perform in front of witnesses was having to perform with your tutor in the room. You might think of wedding night gifts as jewelry or perfumes, but in royal bedchambers, the most treasured presents weren't diamonds. They were fertility talismans. Slip under the covers of a medieval royal bed, and you'd likely find charms tucked beneath pillows, amulets tied to bedposts, or even peculiar foods smuggled into the chamber, all meant to give nature a nudge. The reasoning was simple. Heirs were everything. Producing children wasn't just a private hope, it was a national mandate. So brides and grooms clutched at whatever superstitions they could. A rabbit's foot tied with silk ribbon, a sprig of rosemary sewn into the sheets, or an amulet carved with runes thought to spark fertility. These items weren't hidden out of shame, but proudly included, as though magic itself was on the guest list. One mainstream fact that captures this vividly is the French royal tradition of serving fertility foods at wedding feasts. Almonds, honey, figs, and especially eggs were piled high, not just for taste, but for symbolism. Eggs promised new life, almonds promised prosperity, and honey was believed to heat the blood. By the time the bride and groom slipped into bed, their bellies were already full of symbolism and possibly indigestion. And here's a quirky tidbit. In certain parts of Eastern Europe, grooms were sometimes handed roasted rooster testicles before bed, a supposed guarantee of vigor. If you're imagining the grimace on a young prince's face as he chewed politely while everyone around him nodded approvingly, yes, it was as awkward as it sounds. Historians still argue whether these foods had any real effect beyond placebo, but the faith placed in them was unshakable. You picture the chamber now, soft candlelight dancing over gold-threaded sheets while beneath the pillows little objects rattle faintly. A saint's relic sits in a reliquary at the bedside, perhaps a bone fragment said to aid conception. The bride wears a ribbon dyed green, the colour of fertility, tied discreetly around her wrist. The groom fingers a tiny carved charm in his pocket, whispering a silent prayer to whichever saint was on duty that night. The blend of faith and superstition feels almost childlike, and yet the stakes couldn't be higher. Failure to conceive wasn't just disappointing, it could mean annulment, exile, or the collapse of treaties. You might even say the bed was less about romance and more about agriculture, the business of planting dynastic seeds. And in the strangest twist, sometimes talismans weren't just spiritual, they were physical aids. Certain herbs were brewed into drinks or rubbed on the skin. Some couples even brought small statues of gods or saints into the bed, placing them nearby as though the divine might watch over the night. Whether these figures were comfort or curse, who can say? The irony is clear. Beneath the towering tapestries, in a bed built like a throne, two nervous newlyweds still clung to the same desperate little rituals that peasants used in their cottages. Perhaps that's the most humanizing detail of all, that kings and queens, for all their wealth, still hoped that a sprig of rosemary or a scrap of ribbon might tilt destiny in their favor. And so as you sink deeper into this candlelit chamber, you can almost hear the soft clink of charms shifting beneath the sheets, silent witnesses to a night that mixed politics, superstition, and the fragile hopes of two very anxious royals. You might not realize it, but the heaviest burden of all often fell on the bride. While kings worried about their performance, queens had to prove their purity, an ordeal that could be as humiliating as it was terrifying. Virginity wasn't just a personal matter, it was a national obsession. Picture the young bride, often no older than 16, stripped of her familiar household, dressed in layers of silk, and delivered into a foreign palace where whispers followed her every step. The court wasn't merely curious, they were watchful, waiting for proof that she was untouched. A single rumor could undo alliances, delegitimize heirs, and even lead to annulment. One mainstream fact is the case of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. Years after their marriage, when Henry wanted an annulment, he argued that she hadn't truly been a virgin when they wed because she'd previously married his brother, Prince Arthur. Catherine swore the earlier marriage was never consummated, but the endless trials and debates show just how vital and perilous virginity was as royal currency. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some medieval French courts, midwives were called to inspect brides before the wedding to ensure their virginity. These examinations weren't just invasive, they were sometimes staged for courtiers, turning what should have been private dignity into public theatre. Historians still argue whether these inspections were genuinely medical or merely ceremonial, but either way, the message was the same. A bride's worth was tied to the condition of her body. Imagine the dread. A young woman shaking under the gaze of older nobles, aware that her entire reputation, her family's honor, even the peace between nations, rested on her anatomy. Then, after enduring this scrutiny, she was expected to step into the bedchamber and perform flawlessly, with the added pressure of producing proof on the sheets by dawn. Even more cruelly, the expectation of virginity was paired with the demand for immediate fertility. If a queen did not produce an heir quickly, whispers began, was she barren? Was she cursed? Did she carry some hidden flaw? The contradiction was brutal. Be untouched, then instantly fruitful. You might joke it was history's worst job description, but for queens, it was a matter of survival. The irony is that while virginity was fetishized, it also created practical problems. Some couples, both young and inexperienced, fumbled so much on their wedding nights that consummation took weeks, months, even years. Marie Antoinette again comes to mind. Her delayed consummation became not just family gossip, but a European diplomatic crisis. And yet, the blame rarely fell on the groom. If things went wrong, the bride's reputation took the hit. She was the one whispered about in corridors, the one whose fertility charms were questioned, the one whose tears went unnoticed behind curtains heavy with embroidery. You imagine her now, lying stiffly in a bed that feels more like a tribunal than a sanctuary, while shadows of courtiers flicker outside the door. The silence is unbearable, broken only by the sound of her own nervous breathing. Somewhere in the distance, a servant prepares the linens for display, ready to become evidence of her innocence. It's hard not to feel a pang of sympathy. Beneath all the gold-threaded gowns and jeweled crowns, these brides were children thrust into roles larger than themselves. Their bodies became proof of treaties, their tears just another unrecorded detail of dynastic politics. And while history remembers their names, it rarely remembers the weight of that first night, the crushing, merciless demand to be both pure and fruitful all at once. Ever wondered what it would feel like if your wedding night was staged like a Broadway show? In the French court, that wasn't far from the truth. Where other kingdoms shrouded intimacy behind thick curtains, France sometimes turned it into an extravaganza, equal parts ritual, performance and gossip fodder for every noble with a fan in hand. The French monarchy thrived on spectacle. Everything from coronations to mealtimes was done in public, with carefully orchestrated ceremony, and the royal bedchamber was no exception. When a dauphin married his bride, the couple was often escorted into their chamber by a glittering procession of courtiers, bishops and ambassadors. The room itself gleamed like a stage, silk drapes, tapestries depicting mythological lovers, and gilded furniture that seemed less like decor and more like props for a performance. One mainstream fact is that Louis XIV, the Sun King, made the royal bed a literal stage. Every morning and evening, he allowed nobles to witness his lever and coucher rituals, his rising and retiring to bed. Though not specifically about the wedding night, this set a precedent for how the monarchy turned even the private act of going to bed into a public drama. When it came to wedding nights, the same principle applied. The act wasn't just between two people, but between the crown and its entire audience. And here's a quirky tidbit. At some French weddings, musicians played outside the bridal chamber to set the mood. Imagine trying to consummate your marriage with a lute strumming softly at the door and the occasional muffled giggle of nobles lingering in the hallway. Historians still argue whether this was meant to encourage or simply entertain the restless crowd, but the absurdity of the soundtrack is hard to miss. For brides, this meant walking into a bedchamber that felt like a theatre spotlight. Every gesture mattered. Did she look timid or bold? Did the groom smile or grimace? Observers would gossip endlessly about the couple's body language, as though interpreting a play. The stakes weren't reviews in the local paper. It was the stability of alliances and the future of dynasties. You picture the scene, candles blazing in golden sconces, courtiers pressed shoulder to shoulder, whispering and fanning themselves as the young couple undressed. Curtains were drawn, not to hide, but to mark the beginning of the performance. When the nobles finally departed, they didn't close the door quietly. They made a show of blessing the bed, calling out good wishes, and sometimes even tossing sugared almonds onto the sheets. Romantic? Not exactly. Memorable? Absolutely. The irony, of course, is that despite all this spectacle, the actual couple often felt lost in the noise. Behind the embroidered curtains, they were still just two nervous people trying to figure out how to be husband and wife. But their private whispers were drowned out by the clinking of goblets, the rustle of gowns, and the laughter echoing down the corridors. So, as you let the image fade, you can almost hear the fading notes of a lute, the scent of spiced wine lingering in the air, and the heavy silence that follows once the last courtier slips away. A silence that feels less like privacy and more like the hush of an audience waiting for the next act. And you might not expect it, but while France treated the royal bedchamber like a theatre, Spain made it more like a courtroom. If French wedding nights were filled with music and laughter, Spanish ones were marked by solemnity, prayer, and an almost suffocating sense of duty. The Catholic monarchs saw intimacy not just as a personal act, but as a holy obligation, policed by both church and crown. Imagine the chamber, dark wood panelling, crucifixes hanging above the bed, and incense lingering faintly in the air. Instead of lute players strumming outside, there's the low murmur of priests reciting blessings. Privacy was still scarce, but the atmosphere felt less playful and more judicial. To fail in this chamber wasn't just to disappoint a dynasty, it was to risk offending God himself. One mainstream fact comes from the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469. Chroniclers note how their union was steeped in religious ceremony, with blessings and rituals ensuring divine approval. Their marriage bed was treated almost like an altar, a place where politics and piety fused, and because their reign became synonymous with Catholic orthodoxy, their approach to marriage intimacy was later held up as a model of devout propriety. But here's a quirky tidbit. In some Spanish courts, it was customary for the newlyweds to be escorted to their chamber while hymns were sung and candles blessed by priests were carried into the room. Imagine trying to set the mood while a solemn hymn echoes down the hallway. Historians still argue whether these blessings were meant to comfort or to intimidate, but either way they made the bedroom feel like a chapel more than a sanctuary. The scrutiny didn't stop there. Spanish monarchs often lived under the shadow of confession, meaning that even the most intimate parts of their lives might be revealed to priests. If a marriage wasn't consummated promptly, spiritual advisors might be called in to guide the couple, sometimes urging them with the gentle but insistent reminder that their duty was both political and divine. For the bride, this meant carrying not only the burden of virginity and fertility, but also the pressure of piety. To falter wasn't merely a personal embarrassment, it risked being framed as a sin. The irony is that in trying to make the wedding night holier, Spain often made it colder, airing guilt onto an act already tangled with nerves. You imagine it now, the couple beneath heavy blankets, a crucifix casting a shadow on the wall, while in the hallway priests and nobles murmur prayers. The candles flicker, but instead of warmth, they cast a stern glow. The silence isn't comfortable, it's watchful, expectant, almost suffocating. Compared to France's noisy celebrations, the Spanish model feels austere, almost monastic, and yet both traditions had the same goal, to ensure that a marriage was not just a pageant, but a contract sealed in flesh, faith and power. So as you let this image fade, you're left with the paradox of Spain's severity. The holiest night of a queen's life often felt less like a union of hearts and more like a trial conducted in the eyes of heaven. You might not expect it, but in the far north, where icy winds rattled the wooden shutters of great halls, royal wedding nights were less about solemn silence and more about rowdy celebration. In Scandinavia, the first night of marriage often involved ale, laughter, and the not-so-subtle presence of witnesses who made sure the bed was properly blessed, with noise, song, and sometimes a little too much curiosity. Picture a timber hall lit by roaring hearth fires, long tables still sticky with mead from the feast line the room. Outside, the sound of fiddles and pipes continues well into the night. Instead of hushed prayers, the newlyweds are carried to their chamber with boisterous cheers, their friends and family jostling and joking along the way. The air smells of roasted boar, pine smoke, and spilled ale. One mainstream fact comes from Icelandic sagas, which describe how witnesses often accompanied the bride and groom right to the marriage bed, sometimes even lifting the covers to make sure they lay down together. This wasn't simply nosiness, it was about ensuring legitimacy. A marriage without witnesses to the start of consummation could be disputed later, and in a land where inheritance of land and titles meant everything, nobody left it to chance. And here's a quirky tidbit. In Norway, some villages had a tradition called the Sengje konungur, or bed king, a designated guest whose job was to escort the groom to bed and sometimes climb in beside him as a joke, while the crowd laughed and toasted. Imagine being a nervous prince, only to find your cousin sliding under the covers first, raising his mug in salute. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic teasing or occasionally taken too far, but either way it shows how the line between ritual and farce blurred easily in these northern courts. The chamber itself often wasn't the private sanctuary you'd imagine. Curtains might be pulled, but the laughter outside carried through the wooden walls. Guests sometimes gathered at the doorway with horns of mead, singing bawdy songs to encourage fertility. Privacy wasn't the priority, community was. In these traditions, the whole clan celebrated the creation of a new union, as though the bride and groom were actors in a play for everyone's benefit. And yet, beneath the ale-soaked humour, there was still the same pressure faced by kings and queens everywhere: produce heirs, secure alliances, and prove the union was real. The jokes and songs may have softened the tension, but they didn't remove it. You imagine the couple lying in a bed that smelled faintly of cedar, listening to the muffled roar of their guests, equal parts comforted and mortified. The irony is that in some ways this raucous approach may have been kinder than the cold scrutiny of Spanish courts or the theatricality of France. At least the laughter outside reminded the couple that they weren't alone, that their duty, however awkward, was shared by their community. So as you picture that Scandinavian wedding night, you hear the stomp of boots on timber floors, the slosh of ale spilling from mugs, and the laughter of witnesses echoing like a storm outside the bedchamber. In the end, the night was as much about the roar of the hall as it was about the hush behind the curtains. You might not expect this twist, but even beyond Europe, royal wedding nights carried their own strange blend of ritual and politics. Step into the Ottoman Empire, and you'll find that foreign princesses who married into the Sultan's household often learned their new roles not from etiquette books but from the harem, an institution filled with rules, rivalries, and whispered lessons in survival. Picture the Topkapi Palace, domes glowing faintly in the moonlight, marble courtyards hushed after the day's bustle, and deep inside, the secluded harem, where corridors twist like a maze. A foreign bride, perhaps a Venetian or a Hungarian princess, arrives nervous and disoriented, her silks too heavy for the humid air. She's guided not by her husband-to-be, but by eunuchs and older concubines who know exactly how this night is supposed to unfold. One mainstream fact is that Ottoman sultans often used marriage, or strategic concubinage, as tools of statecraft. Official royal weddings were rarer than in Europe, but when they happened, the consummation carried enormous weight. Chroniclers recorded which concubine or bride shared the sultan's bed, and sometimes the harem women themselves ensured that the encounter was managed smoothly. A nervous bride wasn't left entirely to her own devices. She was coached, sometimes even trained, in what to expect. And here's a quirky tidbit. There are accounts of older harem women placing amulets or perfumed sachets under the pillows to ensure fertility, or even whispering incantations at the door as the couple entered. One story claims that pomegranate seeds were sprinkled across the sheets, the fruit symbolizing abundance and children. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread reality or embroidered gossip from Western visitors, but the image is vivid, a royal bed littered with sticky red seeds, their juice staining the silk covers like a strange omen. For the bride, the night was more than awkward, it was dangerous. The harem was a world of competition, where producing an heir could mean rising to power, while failure could mean exile or even worse. Unlike in Europe, where queens typically had secure titles, an Ottoman consort's influence was fragile and conditional. The wedding night wasn't the end of her trial. It was the beginning. You imagine her now, seated on the edge of a low divan, the scent of oud smoke and rosewater thick in the air, her heart pounding as the eunuchs withdraw and the curtains are drawn. Somewhere outside, concubines whisper, weighing their own chances, while older attendants mutter prayers to ward off misfortune. The bride clutches a charm slipped secretly into her palm, a talisman from her homeland, perhaps the only thing connecting her to the life she left behind. The Sultan himself might approach calmly, confident, practiced, but for her, it is a plunge into uncertainty, the first step in a lifetime of intrigue. Unlike the staged performances of France or the solemnity of Spain, this night in the Ottoman palace carries an undercurrent of quiet menace. It isn't just about proving consummation, it's about survival in a world where intimacy and politics are inseparably entwined. And so as you let the scene soften in your mind, you can almost hear the rustle of silks, the faint chanting from the harem's shadows, and the sound of a distant call to prayer echoing over the Bosphorus, reminders that this union, like all royal wedding nights, was never truly private, never truly safe, and never just about love. You might not be surprised to hear this, but if there was ever a monarch whose wedding nights were whispered about endlessly, it was Henry VIII of England. Few rulers left such a trail of gossip, speculation, and outright scandal about what happened or didn't happen behind the curtains. Imagine Henry in his younger years, broad-shouldered, athletic, confident, striding into the chamber with all the bravado of a man who believed himself chosen by God. And yet, For all his swagger, his wedding nights became matters of public debate, dissected by nobles and foreign ambassadors like courtroom evidence. One mainstream fact comes from his marriage to Anne of Cleves. Henry found her unattractive, famously calling her a Flanders mare. On their wedding night in 1540, he reportedly could not bring himself to consummate the union. The marriage was annulled after just 6 months on the grounds of non-consummation, and Henry himself declared he liked her not well before, nor better after. The annulment papers even cited his inability or unwillingness to perform. Whether the problem was physical, psychological, or political, historians still argue to this day. And here's a quirky tidbit. Ambassadors often sent secret letters about Henry's bedroom successes or failures as though they were sports commentators reporting from the sidelines. One Venetian envoy slyly remarked that Henry was more inclined to banquets than to marriage beds in his later years. Imagine being a king only to find your private life mocked in letters passed around European courts. Henry's frustration wasn't limited to Anne. With Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, questions of consummation swirled decades after the wedding. When Henry wanted an annulment, he claimed Catherine hadn't been a virgin since she'd first been married to his brother Arthur. Catherine swore otherwise, insisting her first marriage was never consummated. The entire argument revolved around what had or hadn't happened in a bedchamber 30 years earlier. It wasn't just gossip, it became the legal and theological foundation for England's break with the Catholic Church. Imagine the weight of that. A moment of intimacy, or its absence, reshaping the entire religious and political landscape of Europe. You can almost hear the nervous shuffle of feet in the chamber that first night, unaware that history itself was holding its breath. Henry's later years only deepened the rumours. Some whispered about impotence, others about disease. By the time he married Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr, his body was failing him. Chronic leg ulcers, obesity, and declining health made the wedding nights less about passion and more about political formality. And yet tongues wagged anyway, eager to mock or condemn. The irony is almost painful. Henry VIII, who fathered at least 3 legitimate heirs and countless illegitimate ones, is remembered as much for his supposed failures as for his successes. His wedding nights became legend, their failures exaggerated, their successes overlooked, until he stood in history not just as a king, but as a cautionary tale of passion, pride, and scandal. You picture him now, a heavy figure seated on the edge of a vast bed, tapestries of hunting scenes looming above, a goblet of wine in one hand, his expression equal parts defiance and dread. Outside, ambassadors whisper, servants wait, and somewhere in the shadows the future of England shifts with every rumour, and you realise that no matter how powerful, even a king couldn't escape the velvet trap of expectation. You might not expect it, but one of the most infamous royal wedding night scandals didn't come from England at all. It unfolded in France, with Marie Antoinette and Louis XV. Their union was supposed to bind France and Austria in harmony, but instead it became a political crisis whispered about across Europe, all because of what didn't happen behind closed doors. Picture Versailles in 1770, glittering chandeliers, mirrors stretching endlessly, courtiers dressed in silks brighter than the sunrise. The wedding feast dazzles, the music thunders, and all eyes eventually shift toward the royal couple's chamber. The young Dauphin, Louis, awkward and shy, is barely 16. His bride, Marie Antoinette, is just 14, wide-eyed and utterly unprepared for the weight of expectation that awaits her beneath those embroidered sheets. One mainstream fact is that their marriage went unconsummated for nearly 7 years. 7 years of excuses, confusion, and mounting political tension. The delay became so notorious that foreign ambassadors sent anxious letters home describing with exasperating detail why France's future hung suspended over an untouched bed. Some blamed Louis's shyness, others his possible medical condition, and still others the couple's mutual inexperience. And here's a quirky tidbit. When Joseph II of Austria, Marie Antoinette's brother, visited Versailles, he bluntly wrote home that the couple had no notion how to proceed. Imagine being a queen and your brother travels across borders to give your husband tips in the bedroom. Historians still argue whether Louis's difficulties were physical. Some point to phimosis, a condition that may have required surgery, or simply psychological. Whatever the truth, it became international gossip of the highest order. You can almost feel Marie Antoinette's humiliation. In a court that thrived on rumour, every whisper about her bedroom became ammunition. Pamphlets mocked her as Madame Deficit, not only for financial extravagance but for failing in her primary duty, producing heirs. Meanwhile, Louis, distracted by his hobbies of hunting and lockmaking, seemed oblivious to the urgency. The irony is that once they finally resolved their difficulties, whether through surgery, advice, or sheer persistence, the children arrived quickly. But by then, the damage had been done. The delay had eroded Marie Antoinette's reputation, fueling the slander that would later contribute to her downfall during the Revolution. You picture that long, frustrating period, a gilded bed that looked more like a stage prop than a sanctuary, heavy curtains that seemed to trap the silence, a bride who cried into her pillows, a groom who sneaked away at dawn to chase deer instead of affection. And outside the chamber, an entire court buzzing like hornets, speculating and mocking, while across Europe, monarchs shook their heads at France's bedroom crisis. Historians still argue whether the scandal truly mattered in the grand scheme of politics, or whether it was just an unfortunate distraction. But for the couple themselves, the pressure must have been unbearable. The wedding night that was supposed to cement peace between empires became a 7-year farce that undermined both thrones. So as you drift deeper into this chapter, you can almost hear the distant laughter of courtiers, the sharp scratching of quills on ambassadorial letters, and the heavy sigh of a young queen lying awake, wondering how something so private could become the most public failure of her life. You might not expect it, but in Russia, royal wedding nights were surrounded by a web of superstition so thick it could choke the romance out of any chamber. The Tsars and their brides weren't just bound by politics, they were bound by rituals that blended Orthodox faith with old folk customs, all designed to ensure fertility and ward off evil. Picture Moscow in winter, the Kremlin's towers frosted white, the bells of distant churches echoing through the snow. Inside, in a drafty palace chamber, a new Tsarina sits nervously on a bed piled with fur blankets. The air smells faintly of incense and beeswax, while shadows dance across gilded icons hung on every wall. Instead of giggling attendants or lute players, there are solemn priests, watchful boyars, and servants clutching charms to ward off misfortune. One mainstream fact is that Russian wedding ceremonies often ended with the blessing of the bed itself. Priests sprinkled holy water over the linens, sometimes even walking around the chamber, chanting prayers as though consecrating a chapel. The marriage bed wasn't treated as a place of private intimacy, but as a sacred space where a dynasty's future was forged under heaven's gaze. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some parts of Russia, it was customary to slip a piece of bread or a pinch of salt under the pillow on the wedding night, symbols of prosperity and protection. Some tales even mention axes or knives placed beneath the bed to drive away evil spirits. Imagine trying to sleep with a weapon tucked under your mattress, all because your in-laws thought demons might sneak in during the night. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or limited to rural traditions that seeped into court life, but the image is striking nonetheless. The pressure on the Tsar's bride was immense. She wasn't just expected to conceive quickly, she was expected to embody purity, piety, and obedience. Failure could lead to whispers of curses or divine disfavor. More than one Russian Tsarina was blamed when heirs failed to appear, even if the true problem lay with the groom. The silence of the palace chambers carried heavy judgment, every pause interpreted as an omen. You imagine the couple now, the young Tsar shifting uncomfortably under the scrutiny of religion and superstition, the bride clutching a small cross in her trembling hands. Outside, boyars murmur, waiting for confirmation that the dynasty has been secured. The chamber is cold despite the furs, and the flicker of candlelight only sharpens the tension. Every creak of the bed frame feels like history itself, listening in. The irony is that for all the holy water, salt and charms, Russian royal marriages often faced the same struggles as anywhere else: nervous couples, delayed consummations, or outright failures. The rituals promised protection, but they couldn't erase human fear. Still they persisted, layering superstition upon ceremony until the wedding night resembled a ritual of survival more than a celebration of union. So as you drift further into this scene, you hear the soft chanting of priests, the crackle of a fire battling the Russian cold, and the faint rustle of charms beneath the pillows. It's a reminder that even in gilded palaces, love was less about warmth and more about withstanding the icy expectations of history. You might not expect it, but in the Byzantine Empire, royal wedding nights were as much about palace politics as they were about the nervous couple lying beneath the covers. Behind the jeweled mosaics of Constantinople, intimacy was overseen not just by priests and physicians, but by the quiet, watchful presence of eunuchs, men trusted to guard secrets that could make or break an empire. Picture the great palace of Constantinople, marble corridors gleaming in lamplight, icons of Christ and the Virgin glimmering in gold leaf, and deep inside, a chamber draped with silks imported from the East. A young empress, perhaps no more than 15, waits stiffly on a bed carved with imperial eagles. Her groom, robed in purple, sits beside her, aware that their union isn't private, but part of a spectacle staged for both heaven and empire. One mainstream fact is that Byzantine wedding rituals included a solemn procession into the bridal chamber. Priests blessed the bed, and hymns were sung as the couple was led inside. The emphasis wasn't on passion, but on sanctity. The act was framed as a continuation of the sacrament of marriage, observed by God and guarded by the Church. Even here, however, the line between ritual and surveillance blurred. And here's a quirky tidbit. Eunuchs, those peculiar fixtures of Byzantine court life, often had the job of preparing the bridal chamber. They laid out the linens, checked the relics, and sometimes lingered nearby, supposedly to ensure that all went smoothly. Some accounts even suggest eunuchs acted as confidants or advisors, giving whispered instructions on how to proceed. Historians still argue whether they truly hovered within earshot, or whether their role was more symbolic, but either way, their presence loomed large over the royal bed. The empress herself carried unique burdens. Unlike queens in the West, Byzantine empresses often wielded significant influence, and their ability to produce heirs could grant them power, or leave them dangerously exposed. Whispers of infertility or scandal could turn the court against them, while success meant becoming a mother of emperors, secure in her position. You imagine her now, her jeweled veil removed, her hands trembling slightly as she fingers a small cross left by her nursemaid, while outside the chamber, eunuchs and courtiers murmur in low voices. The groom shifts uneasily, more politician than lover, knowing that whatever happened tonight would ripple through the empire. The flickering oil lamps make the chamber glow like a mosaic, every movement seeming to freeze into an icon of dynastic duty. The irony is that Byzantium, so obsessed with order and sanctity, was also riddled with intrigue. More than one marriage night was followed by rumors. Was the bride truly a virgin? Was the groom too hesitant? Did a eunuch cover up a failure to keep the court calm? The records are full of silences and contradictions, and historians still argue which scandals were real and which were invented as weapons in palace rivalries. So as you let the image fade, you can almost hear the faint chanting of a hymn lingering in the air, the rustle of silk curtains being drawn, and the quiet footsteps of eunuchs retreating into shadow. In Byzantium, even in the most intimate chamber, the empire itself seemed to watch from every corner, its eyes hidden behind mosaic glass. You might not think of a bed as a relic, but in royal courts, the marriage bed itself often became a prized possession, preserved, displayed, and even passed down like a sacred artifact. For common folk, a bed was where you slept. For kings and queens, it was where dynasties began, treaties were sealed, and sometimes where scandals whispered through the sheets turned into state crises. Picture the chamber, a towering four-poster bed carved from oak, its canopy painted with celestial symbols, its linens heavy with gold embroidery. This isn't just furniture, it's theatre, altar, and throne all at once. And when the wedding night passed, the bed didn't simply fade back into obscurity. It became an heirloom, carried into history like a relic of political magic. One mainstream fact is that the so-called Great Bed of Ware in England, though not a royal bed, became famous in the late 16th century for its size and for the legends surrounding it. It was over 10 feet wide, capable of sleeping a dozen people, and became a tourist attraction. Though it wasn't directly tied to royal consummations, it shows how beds themselves could take on mythic status in European culture. Royal beds were even more revered, often preserved in castles and displayed as symbols of dynastic strength. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some courts, particularly in France, ornate wedding beds were paraded publicly before being set up in the chamber. Courtiers admired the craftsmanship, gossiped about the symbolism, and sometimes even touched the posts for luck. Imagine your honeymoon suite turned into a public art exhibit before you got to use it. Historians still argue whether these beds were ever really slept in, or whether they were ceremonial stage props while the real marital duties happened elsewhere, in less ostentatious privacy. The irony is that these beds outlived their owners. Centuries later, tourists wandered through palaces like Hampton Court or Fontainebleau, staring at elaborately canopied beds once whispered over in torchlight. No one remembered the nervous laughter of the young couple beneath the covers, but the wood, the embroidery, and the carved crests endured, mute witnesses to long-forgotten nights. You imagine a bed in Versailles, its curtains faded but still heavy, the mattress long since replaced, but the frame intact. Guides point to it proudly. Here, a king and queen began their dynasty. Yet what they don't mention is that the bed might also have borne witness to awkward silences, whispered prayers, or even outright failures. The relic tells only the story people want it to tell. And yet there's something strangely comforting about these preserved beds. They remind you that history isn't just castles and wars, it's also furniture creaking under the weight of expectation, linens folded by trembling hands, curtains drawn around fragile moments. The bed becomes a bridge between the grand and the intimate, between the public myth and the private truth. So as you let the image settle in your mind, you see the bed not as just wood and fabric, but as a stage where love, duty, fear, and scandal all played their parts. And long after the couple faded into memory, the bed remained, silent and solid, like a relic of history's most human drama. You might not expect it, but even the stars had a say in royal wedding nights. In courts from India to Italy, the heavens were consulted before the bride and groom ever touched their bed. Astrological timing wasn't a fringe curiosity, it was often the deciding factor for when a marriage, and especially its consummation, could begin. Picture a royal chamber waiting in silence, candles already lit, sheets already sprinkled with perfumed water, and yet no one dares to usher the couple inside. Why? Because the astrologer hasn't given the signal. Outside, courtiers whisper impatiently, glancing at the night sky, waiting for Venus to climb a little higher, or for Mars to move out of the wrong house. In some cases, the entire consummation could be delayed for days, sometimes even weeks, until the stars aligned just right. One mainstream fact is that Catherine de' Medici, the powerful Queen of France, was famously guided by astrologers in nearly every aspect of her life. While there's no diary of her wedding night schedule, historians know her court believed deeply in celestial influence. It's easy to imagine her wedding bed prepared only once the court astrologer confirmed that Jupiter's blessings outweighed Saturn's shadow. And here's a quirky tidbit. In certain parts of Renaissance Italy, couples were warned against consummating during eclipses which were thought to produce deformed children. Some even believed that consummation under the wrong moon phase could doom an heir to weakness. Imagine the frustration of a young groom, already sweating from nerves, told by a solemn astrologer to wait another 3 nights. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were strictly enforced or more symbolic, but the fact remains, intimacy was tangled up with the cosmos. You picture the scene now, the couple seated side by side on a velvet bed, hands fidgeting, while an old man in star-embroidered robes squints through a window at the constellations. The silence stretches. Finally, he nods gravely, declaring that the heavens approve. Only then do the courtiers step back, the doors close, and the couple is allowed to proceed. For the royals it was both comforting and oppressive. On the one hand, success or failure could be blamed on the stars rather than personal shortcomings. On the other, who wants to be told their marriage might collapse because Mercury was in retrograde? The irony is that while we chuckle today, many rulers staked their legitimacy on these beliefs. A child born at the right celestial moment could be hailed as heaven's chosen heir. A child born at the wrong time might face suspicion for life. One anxious pause under the bed curtains could ripple into decades of political debate. So as you let the image fade, you see the wedding night not as an intimate choice, but as a cosmic appointment. The bed may have been draped in silk, but above it stretched an invisible canopy of stars, silent, distant, and yet, in the minds of courtiers, deciding everything that happened beneath. You might not expect it, but no royal bedchamber was complete without its secret stash of helpers, strange concoctions, herbs and foods, believed to fan the flames of passion or guarantee fertility. While today you might reach for a glass of champagne and some chocolate, kings and queens often relied on oysters, spices, or potions so peculiar you'd hesitate to swallow them. Picture the chamber, gilded bedposts gleaming in candlelight, silk sheets drawn tight, and on a nearby table a silver tray piled high with so-called aphrodisiacs. A goblet of spiced wine sits beside bowls of figs, pomegranates, and almonds. The air smells faintly of cinnamon and cloves, as though the palace kitchens doubled as an apothecary. The scene looks decadent, but beneath the surface it's pure anxiety, every bite a desperate insurance policy against failure. One mainstream fact is that oysters have been considered an aphrodisiac for centuries, particularly in Renaissance courts. Casanova himself, though not royal, famously claimed to eat dozens before his romantic encounters. Royals took the idea seriously too, sending servants to fetch barrels of oysters to serve at wedding feasts, ensuring the groom entered the chamber fortified. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some medieval German courts, brides were given little sachets of powdered beetles or herbs to sprinkle under the sheets. These powders were supposed to heat the blood or stir desire. Historians still argue whether such potions had any effect at all. Most likely they were placebo, but the faith placed in them shows how desperate rulers were to leave nothing to chance. You imagine the nervous couple now, the groom forcing down a plate of sticky figs, convinced they'll spark virility, while the bride sips an herbal brew so bitter she winces but dares not refuse. Outside advisors nod knowingly, certain the medicine will do its job. Inside, the couple's stomachs churn as much from nerves as from questionable remedies. The irony is that some of these foods probably did more harm than good. Spiced wine might warm the blood, but too much could leave the groom stumbling drunk. Certain herbs acted more like sedatives than stimulants. One record even tells of a nobleman who fell asleep on his wedding night after downing too much elixir, much to the frustration of his bride and to the amusement of the entire court when rumours spread the next morning. Historians still debate how much royals believed in these aids versus how much they performed belief for the sake of appearances. Was the spiced wine truly about passion, or simply a ritual to reassure everyone that every possible precaution had been taken? Either way, the bedchamber often smelled less like roses and more like a strange stew of honey, herbs, and superstition. So as you drift into this scene, you hear the clink of goblets, the rustle of trays being carried in, and the faint murmur of servants whispering about whether the concoctions will work this time. And you realize that beneath the gold-threaded sheets, the nervous royals weren't just relying on each other. They were relying on figs, oysters, and powders that promised a dynasty in every bite. You might not expect it, but in royal courts, gossip was often as deadly as daggers. A single whispered rumor about what happened or didn't happen on a wedding night could topple reputations, undermine treaties, and sometimes even bring down entire dynasties. Forget the sheets, forget the witnesses. The real trial began in the court of public opinion. Picture the palace corridors the morning after, torches guttering low, servants sweeping rushes from the marble floors, and courtiers already clustered in corners, murmuring in tones both hushed and gleeful. Did they? Didn't they? The speculation begins before the couple has even risen from bed, and by the time the day's councils assemble, the gossip has rippled outward like cracks in ice, reaching every ear from chambermaids to ambassadors. One mainstream fact is the annulment of Louis VII of France's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Though their union produced children, whispers about incompatibility and Eleanor's supposed passionlessness spread like wildfire, fueling claims that the marriage was spiritually and perhaps physically incomplete. The annulment gave Eleanor the freedom to remarry Henry II of England, a scandalous move that reshaped the map of Europe, all sparked, at least in part, by the gossip mill of a royal bedchamber. And here's a quirky tidbit. In the Tudor court of England, gossip about Henry VIII's wives became so rampant that ambassadors often acted like tabloid reporters. They wrote home with intimate details, sometimes wildly exaggerated, about the king's supposed performance. One Venetian envoy described Henry's struggles with Anne of Cleves as though reviewing a play. Imagine your nation's fate resting on reports that read like gossip columns. Historians still argue whether these reports were accurate or simply propaganda. Was Catherine Howard truly unfaithful, or was her downfall engineered by enemies who spread rumours about her wedding night? Did Anne Boleyn really confess to unspeakable acts, or were the stories fabricated to justify her execution? In every case, it wasn't just the act itself that mattered, but the narrative spun around it. You imagine the whispers curling through the palace. A maid exaggerates what she saw, a noble adds flourish to the tale, an ambassador scribbles it down, and suddenly Europe believes a king is impotent or a queen is unchaste. The truth hardly matters once the story takes flight. The gossip mill grinds on, indifferent to facts, hungry for scandal. The irony is that even centuries later, historians find themselves repeating those same rumours. Entire chapters of royal biographies hinge on what might have been palace gossip. Did Louis XVI truly fail to consummate his marriage for 7 years, or was that just Austrian propaganda? Did Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon truly bond on their first night, or was it pious fiction crafted by chroniclers? The debate lingers, echoing the whispers of courtiers long dead. So as you let this scene fade, you hear the hum of voices in stone corridors, the clatter of quills scratching half-truths into parchment, and the sly laughter of nobles who knew that sometimes the sharpest weapon in the arsenal wasn't the sword, but the rumour whispered through the walls of a royal bedchamber. You might not expect it, but not every royal wedding night was about just the bride and groom. Sometimes, hidden in the shadows or even openly hovering at court, there were other figures, mistresses, rivals, and former lovers, whose presence turned a supposedly sacred union into a battlefield of jealousy and intrigue. Picture a glittering ballroom fading into silence as the couple is escorted to their chamber. Behind the smiling courtiers, you notice eyes watching with something sharper than curiosity. A mistress, dressed in jewels gifted by the same groom, lingers in the crowd. She knows this night could change everything. If the bride conceives quickly, her own influence may vanish. If not, she might keep her grip on the king's heart. The bedchamber is about to become an invisible tug-of-war between love, power, and survival. One mainstream fact comes from France's Henry IV, known as the Good King Henry. On his wedding night with Margaret of Valois, gossip swirled that he was less eager for his bride than for his mistress, Gabrielle d'Estrées. Courtiers whispered that he spent as much time sneaking glances at Gabrielle as he did at his new queen, and the scandal of his divided affections haunted the marriage for years. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some Italian courts, mistresses were so entrenched in royal households that they occasionally helped prepare the bridal chamber, choosing perfumes arranging flowers, even offering sly advice. Historians still argue whether this was a pragmatic acceptance of court life or a cruel humiliation for the new bride, but the image is striking, a queen's rival tucking lavender sprigs into her wedding bed. The tension this created was electric. A bride entered the chamber not just to consummate her marriage, but to compete against women who already knew the groom's affections. Failure to conceive quickly might be blamed not on fate or biology, but on the lingering shadow of another woman. Even worse, if the king spent more time in his mistress's bed than his queen's, political crises could erupt. After all, heirs weren't legitimate unless born of the queen. You imagine the young bride lying in a bed carved with dynastic crests, hearing muffled laughter in a nearby corridor. Was it servants gossiping? Or was it the groom's mistress still holding court just beyond the door? The flicker of the candle feels harsher in that moment, the silence heavier, as though the chamber itself knows it's become a contested space. The irony is that in some cases mistresses wielded as much power as queens, if not more. In France, Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry were household names shaping politics as surely as any royal decree. For the new brides who shared their husbands' chambers, consummation was less about romance and more about staking a fragile claim in a palace already filled with rivals. So as you drift deeper into this uneasy night, you hear not just the creak of the bed frame, but also the echo of heels clicking in distant corridors, the soft rustle of a silk gown belonging to someone who should not be there, yet always is, reminding you that no royal wedding night was ever truly free of shadows. You might not expect it, but not all royal wedding nights followed the rules. Some were never meant to happen in the first place. Secret ceremonies, clandestine vows, and forbidden matches hidden away from the eyes of court and church alike. These unions carried no trumpets or gilded canopies, just whispers in candle-lit chapels or hurried blessings in garden pavilions. And yet their wedding nights could shake kingdoms. Picture a young prince slipping through a shadowed corridor, his cloak pulled tight, meeting his beloved in a small chamber far from the glare of courtiers. The bed here isn't draped in embroidered silk but covered with a simple quilt. There are no ambassadors peering in, no priests sprinkling holy water over the linens, just two frightened but determined figures claiming a night the world has forbidden them. One mainstream fact is the marriage of Edward IV of England to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464. Their wedding was conducted in secret, shocking the nobility when it came to light. Edward had chosen love over politics, marrying a commoner widow instead of a foreign princess. Their secret consummation was more than romance. It ignited tensions that would echo through the Wars of the Roses, where every heir's legitimacy was questioned. And here's a quirky tidbit. In Scotland, there were traditions of hand-fasting, where couples could exchange vows privately, sometimes with nothing more than clasped hands and witnesses. These unions could be consummated immediately, with the act itself sometimes serving as proof of marriage. Historians still argue whether such arrangements were legally binding or merely tolerated, but in a world obsessed with lineage, they carried enormous weight. The risks of secret consummations were immense. If the union was discovered, the couple could face annulment, exile, or worse. Yet the passion that drove these clandestine marriages often made them unforgettable. Picture Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister, who secretly married Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. Their defiance enraged her brother, though he eventually forgave them. Still, their private vows turned their first night together into an act of political rebellion as much as love. For the brides, the danger was even sharper. A hidden union meant no public validation of their virginity, no ceremonial sheets displayed, no witnesses to confirm legitimacy. Their reputations could be shredded if rumors spread that they had given themselves without proper marriage. And yet, many risked everything for the promise of love over duty. You imagine the quiet intimacy of such a night. No chamber musicians, no maids hovering outside, just the creak of floorboards and the beating of two terrified hearts. The flicker of a single candle casts long shadows, as though even the walls are uncertain whether to keep the secret. The irony is that some of the most powerful dynasties in Europe sprang from such forbidden unions. Love, whispered in the dark, and consummated in secrecy, sometimes produced heirs who changed history. And while official chronicles often buried these nights in silence, the truth lingered in gossip, ballads, and scandalous pamphlets. So as you let this image settle, you see a bed not gilded with politics, but glowing faintly with the fragile fire of defiance, and you realize that in a world of arranged marriages and suffocating ritual, the most scandalous secret of all was simple: love dared to choose for itself. You might not expect it, but sometimes one awkward wedding night could set off a chain reaction that rattled entire kingdoms. A single failure in the royal bed could mean annulments, wars, or even the collapse of dynasties. Intimacy wasn't just personal, it was political gunpowder waiting for a spark. Picture a palace buzzing with unease the morning after. The sheets are inspected, whispers circle the corridors, and ambassadors scribble furiously in their journals. Nothing happened, one maid mutters. By dusk, that quiet rumor has grown into a storm, shaking treaties and fueling rivalries. In the world of royalty, a failed consummation was never just an awkward moment, it was a scandal that could topple thrones. One mainstream fact is the story of Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Their union, celebrated with pomp, was plagued by rumors of incompatibility. Eleanor reportedly complained that Louis was more monk than husband. Whether or not their wedding night was truly a failure, the perception of it weakened their bond. Eventually, their marriage was annulled, and Eleanor went on to marry Henry II of England, shifting enormous territories from French to English control. A bedroom grievance reshaped the map of Europe. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some courts, annulments weren't just legal proceedings, but near-theatrical trials of intimacy. Witnesses might be summoned to testify about the couple's private life, and physicians could be asked to examine the groom. One infamous case in France involved a nobleman who was publicly tested for impotence in front of a panel of judges, with his wife watching. Historians still argue whether these humiliations were about genuine truth-seeking or simply political theatre, but either way, the absurdity was staggering. The stakes were highest for queens. If consummation failed, the bride was often painted as cursed or barren. Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's ill-fated fourth wife, endured exactly this. Their marriage was annulled within months, with Henry claiming it was never consummated. Though Anne escaped with her life, unlike some of Henry's other wives, the humiliation of having her wedding night dissected in public followed her forever. You imagine the pressure inside that chamber, two strangers beneath embroidered sheets, one nervous misstep threatening years of diplomacy. The flicker of a candle feels like an interrogation light. Every pause, every silence is recorded in the nervous glances of attendants hovering outside. You almost hear the scratching of quills as rumors are carried beyond the palace walls before dawn even breaks. The irony is that sometimes these failures weren't failures at all. Consummation may have happened, but if politics demanded an annulment, the official story became one of impotence, frigidity, or divine disfavor. The truth was often irrelevant once the gossip gained momentum. So as you sink into this uneasy scene, you realize the royal bed was never just a place of rest. It was a battlefield where silence could be louder than swords, and one awkward night could redraw the borders of empires. You might not expect it, but sometimes the most scandalous wedding night secrets weren't about what happened in the bed, but about who eventually claimed the child that followed. In courts obsessed with heirs, the fear of impostors, switched infants, or fabricated heirs haunted dynasties like a lingering ghost. A single whispered doubt, is that really his child, could unravel years of treaties and plunge kingdoms into chaos. Picture a royal nursery months after a grand wedding. The baby lies swaddled in silk. The proud parents beam for the court, and yet in the corners courtiers exchange sceptical glances. Was the marriage even consummated properly? If not, whose child is this? The walls hum with speculation, and suddenly the private intimacy of the wedding night becomes a very public debate about legitimacy. One mainstream fact is the controversy surrounding Mary, Queen of Scots, and her son James the XVI. Whispers claimed that James was not fathered by her husband, Lord Darnley, but by her close confidant, the Italian musician David Rizzio. Though historians dismiss this as unlikely, the rumours haunted Mary's reputation and gave her enemies ammunition. James would go on to unite the crowns of Scotland and England, but his very legitimacy was once a subject of venomous court gossip. And here's a quirky tidbit. In medieval Spain, there are accounts of impostors claiming to be the rightful heirs of the throne, insisting that they were hidden away as infants to protect them after suspicious wedding nights. These so-called false princes sometimes attracted real followings. Historians still argue whether a few of these pretenders were delusional opportunists, or whether they just might, have been swapped children raised in secret. The paranoia was constant. Bedsheets could be stained, witnesses could nod approvingly, and yet months later the birth of a suspiciously early child raised eyebrows. Was conception really the result of that ceremonious wedding night, or had someone else stolen into the Queen's chamber? Entire wars of succession hinged on these questions, and accusations of illegitimacy were political weapons as sharp as swords. You imagine the bride now lying in her chamber with a newborn cradled beside her, while outside the door murmurs already swirl. Too soon, too late, too suspicious. Servants whisper that the child doesn't resemble the king. Nobles whisper that the Queen had a lover. Ambassadors send coded letters hinting that treaties may collapse if the heir is not genuine. The bed where she once trembled on her wedding night has become an invisible courtroom, still casting judgment long after the candles went out. The irony is that sometimes false heirs and impostors lasted longer than the true ones. Perkin Warbeck in England, who claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, gathered armies and threatened Henry VII's throne for years. His entire case rested on doubts sown from wedding night secrets and succession mysteries decades earlier. So as you let the image fade, you see how the royal bed didn't just shape one night, it haunted generations. A union left unconsummated, an heir born at the wrong time, or an impostor seizing the story. All of it turned bedrooms into battlefields where truth and fiction fought for crowns. You might not expect it, but sometimes royal couples weren't even alone on their wedding nights. Not really. Hidden eyes, prying ears, and unwanted witnesses could turn an already nerve-wracking ritual into something downright nightmarish. Servants, guards, physicians, and even nobles found ways to linger, ensuring that nothing, absolutely nothing, went unsupervised. Picture the chamber. Thick curtains drawn around a bed carved with crests, candles sputtering in iron sconces. You'd think the couple finally had a moment of privacy until you noticed the faint shadow of someone crouched near the door. A servant tasked with listening. The air is heavy with silence, but it's not a comfortable one. It's the silence of people trying not to be caught watching. One mainstream fact is that in Tudor England, the bedding ceremony was often attended by nobles and family members who escorted the couple to bed and sometimes lingered until they were settled. Some chroniclers even describe courtiers joking, nudging, and laughing at the couple's expense before finally withdrawing. And in a few cases, not everyone left. Some witnesses deliberately stayed behind, hidden, to make sure consummation began. And here's a quirky tidbit. In medieval Poland, there are records of noble guests literally sitting in the same chamber while the couple lay under the covers, waiting for signs of activity. Sometimes they even clapped or sang to encourage things along. Imagine trying to focus on your new spouse while a group of half-drunk dukes cheer from the foot of the bed. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic encouragement or if witnesses truly lingered long enough to make things uncomfortably real. But either way, the tradition blurs the line between comedy and cruelty. The irony, of course, is that the presence of these witnesses was supposed to protect the marriage by proving that it had begun legitimately. But for the couple, it often created paralysis. A nervous bride might lie frozen, a groom too anxious to move, both acutely aware that ears were pressed to the door, or eyes peeking through cracks. You imagine the flicker of lamplight casting long shadows on stone walls, while behind the curtains, whispers are barely stifled. Outside, guards shift their weight noisily, deliberately letting the couple know they're not alone. Somewhere in the corner, a maid suppresses a laugh. The chamber feels less like a sanctuary and more like a stage where failure is guaranteed by the very presence of its audience. And it didn't end with servants. Ambassadors sometimes demanded confirmation of consummation, waiting impatiently for news to report back to their courts. In one French court, sheets were snatched up before dawn and paraded through the halls while half the court still smelled of last night's wine. If the evidence was lacking, rumours began instantly. Rumours that could ruin reputations before breakfast. Historians still debate whether some of the most scandalous rumours in Europe, the impotent king, the barren queen, the unfaithful bride, were born not of truth but of the eager eyes and ears of those unwanted witnesses. After all, when privacy doesn't exist, stories thrive in the cracks. So as you let this scene fade, you can almost hear the muffled cough of a guard outside, the shuffle of feet just beyond the curtains, and the nervous laughter of a bride and groom who realize that on their wedding night they were never truly alone. You might not expect it, but over time, the royal wedding night shifted from being a public ritual of duty to a more private, though still pressure-filled moment that began to resemble romance. What started as a performance for the court, complete with witnesses and paraded sheets, slowly evolved into something more recognizably human. Picture the change. In a medieval castle, torches blazed and nobles crowded the bedchamber door, waiting for proof. But by the Renaissance, and especially into the Enlightenment, the spectacle began to soften. Curtains were pulled tighter, corridors were better guarded, and the audience shrank. The wedding night was still political, but slowly, ever so slowly, it began to allow for tenderness. One mainstream fact is that by the 18th century, many royal couples were no longer forced into fully public bedding ceremonies. Louis XV and Marie Antoinette, for example, were escorted to their chamber amid pomp, but once the ritual was complete, the court withdrew. The failure to consummate was still everyone's business, of course, but at least the couple had the illusion of privacy while they struggled through 7 awkward years. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some German principalities, brides were given little pamphlets of romantic poetry alongside their fertility charms. Instead of just being drilled on duty, they were offered lines of love verses, meant to encourage intimacy as something sweeter than obligation. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine cultural shift or just another layer of performance, but it marks a fascinating transition from a wedding bed as stage to a wedding bed as something closer to sanctuary. Imagine the bride and groom now. No drunken dukes cheering at the door, no priests whispering advice from the corner. Instead, a few candles flicker gently, a quilt embroidered not with crests but with flowers, and a moment of silence that feels less suffocating and more tender. For the first time in centuries, the couple might actually have a chance to discover each other without an audience taking notes. The irony is that while the rituals relaxed, the stakes didn't. Dynasties still needed heirs, alliances still hinged on fertility, and rumours still spread like wildfire if conception was delayed. Privacy grew, but pressure never disappeared. The wedding night remained a paradox, more personal in setting, but still crushingly public in consequence. You picture that transition unfolding over generations, from the raucous halls of Scandinavia to the hushed chapels of Spain, and finally to the candlelit bedrooms of Enlightenment Europe. Each step reduced the number of witnesses, each step allowed for a little more affection, a little more humanity. Yet behind every curtain, the expectation lingered. The bed was still both throne and trap. So as you let this scene soften in your mind, you can almost hear the faint creak of a canopy bed settling under 2 young royals who, for once, are allowed a whisper of privacy. Though history, as always, waits just outside the door, ready to judge what happens next. You might not expect it, but by the time the Victorians got their hands on the stories of royal wedding nights, the scandalous details were either scrubbed clean or twisted into lurid cautionary tales. What had once been bawdy songs, whispered gossip, and paraded sheets became either sanitized morality plays or exaggerated dramas retold for a hungry public. Picture the 19th century drawing room, lace curtains drawn against the fog, a fire crackling politely, and respectable ladies sipping tea while recounting tales of improper queens and unfortunate kings. The actual facts of medieval or Renaissance wedding nights were too indecent to discuss openly, so Victorians polished them into fables. A king's impotence became a lesson about the dangers of gluttony or lust. A queen's delayed fertility was reframed as tragic romance rather than awkward fumbling in a gilded bed. One mainstream fact is the way Marie Antoinette's 7-year delay in consummation was retold in Victorian histories. Where her contemporaries had mocked and ridiculed her, 19th century writers often softened the story, portraying her as a delicate, misunderstood bride trapped in a loveless marriage. The raw scandal was blurred into sentimental tragedy, fitting the Victorian taste for moral lessons wrapped in velvet. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian authors gleefully published supposed secret histories of royal marriages, complete with sensational claims that bore little resemblance to truth. One pamphlet confidently declared that Catherine the Great's wedding night involved wild foreign rites, a claim historians still roll their eyes at. Yet readers devoured these embellished tales, as if royal beds were exotic theatres of both morality and depravity. Historians still argue whether these stories were products of genuine research or just proto-tabloids designed to sell copies in smoky London bookshops. You imagine the strange duality, prim Victorian matrons insisting on modesty, while at the same time secretly relishing scandalous whispers about Tudors and Bourbons. The wedding night became less about dynastic duty and more about entertainment, a safe, distanced way to peek into royal bedrooms without admitting to curiosity. For the royals of the day, this retelling was both blessing and curse. Their ancestors' failures were softened, but their own unions came under sharper scrutiny. Queen Victoria herself, despite her reputation for propriety, had her wedding night gossiped about in polite circles. It was said she adored Prince Albert passionately, a detail that made readers blush and lean in closer. Even in sanitized times, people couldn't resist imagining the flicker of candles over royal sheets. The irony is that Victorian retellings often told us more about Victorian anxieties than about the past. Obsessed with purity, fertility, and morality, they reshaped centuries of messy human wedding nights into either edifying tales or salacious gossip, whichever sold better. So as you let the image drift, you see the royal bed not in torchlit castles, but in dusty history books, its secrets filtered through moralizing pens and curious readers. The scandal was still there, but now it wore a corset and gloves. You might not expect it, but even today, faint echoes of those old rituals still ripple through modern royal weddings. We may not have priests sprinkling holy water on the sheets or ambassadors hovering outside the door, but the public's fascination with what happens after the ceremony hasn't entirely faded. The royal bedchamber, though now private, is still a space onto which the world projects its curiosity, hopes, and gossip. Picture a modern palace, electric lamps instead of candlelight, security guards instead of drunken dukes, and silken bed sheets purchased from discreet luxury suppliers rather than displayed to half the kingdom. When Prince Charles married Lady Diana in 1981, the world tuned in for the fairy tale ceremony, and yet in private, the marriage's troubles began almost immediately. The difference is that in the past, sheets would have been paraded. In the present, rumours leaked through tabloids. The method changed, but the appetite for scandal never disappeared. One mainstream fact is that in 1947, when Princess Elizabeth married Prince Philip, newspapers openly speculated about whether their union would be fruitful, a thinly veiled reminder of centuries-old anxieties about heirs. Within a year, Prince Charles was born, proving that even in the 20th century, fertility was still bound to monarchy's legitimacy. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some modern royal weddings, subtle traces of superstition still linger. When Kate Middleton married Prince William in 2011, She carried sprigs of myrtle in her bouquet, a tradition dating back to Queen Victoria, symbolizing fertility and continuity. Historians still argue whether these gestures are just quaint symbols or the faint survival of the same anxieties that once demanded stained sheets as proof. Today, of course, the idea of a public bedding ceremony would seem absurd, even grotesque. Yet tabloids and television fill that voyeuristic void. Instead of waiting outside the chamber door, the public waits for headlines, paparazzi shots, or the announcement of a royal pregnancy. The scrutiny is softer, but it's still there, humming beneath the glittering ceremonies. You imagine the contrast: a medieval court pounding on the walls with bawdy songs, and a modern public scrolling through headlines on glowing screens. Both are waiting for the same answer: has the dynasty secured its future? The irony is that for all the centuries of spectacle, politics and scandal, the royal wedding night has always come down to the same fragile moment. Two people, nervous and unsteady, trying to navigate intimacy under the crushing weight of expectation. And so, as you reach the end of this long drift through velvet curtains and candlelit chambers, you let the lights dim lower, your breathing slow, and the noise of scandal soften into silence. Now, let the wind down carry you into rest. The old courts have emptied, the watchers have gone home. The sheets, once paraded, lie still. The laughter and whispers of ambassadors fade into nothing but distant echoes. The bed, once a throne of duty and dread, becomes only a bed, quiet, steady, a place to lie down without fear. The flicker of candles becomes a soft hum, fading into the background like a lullaby. The heavy curtains sway gently, no longer stage props but gentle veils against the world. The burden of dynasties lifts, and all that remains is the simple rhythm of breath in the dark. You can almost hear the silence of forgotten palaces, the hush of corridors where gossip once thrived, now empty, now calm. In that stillness, history loosens its grip, letting you drift away. So close your eyes, release the last weight of scandal and expectation, and rest in the thought that even the most dramatic nights fade into quiet eventually.